Hello and welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us at this to be session today at Sweevy. It's first day. It's a happy morning. I hope you've enjoyed some of the other sessions that we've had. This is your first one. Well, that's extra special, and thank you so much for that. As you see on the slide, we have a fun word cloud through Menti. It's right there in the chat. You can use that code. Please share with us what comes to mind when you hear the word data, or even if it's data. What comes to mind when you hear that word? Please go to menti.com and use the code 94003790 to participate in the word cloud. Again, welcome to you all. Thank you so much for sharing your time today as we come together to think about this. I see that in the chat, information. Righty. So what comes to your mind when you hear the word data? I don't know if this is a word, but sometimes it's huh, what? With the ellipses and the question mark. A major there. And you can please also introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from, if you want to share your responsibility and role at the agency or nonprofit or philanthropic agency operation where you are, please just do share. Thank you so much. We still have people entering. Come on in. Look at that word cloud growing. Information. That's the big one on there. Interpretation. That's a curious word. Interpretation. What are we going to see here? Numbers. I saw that scary on there. I saw that one. I sure did. Um, Questions, insight, excited. Oh, that's wonderful to have excitement about data. That means it feels good to you and you like what it can tell you. So that is wonderful. Look, it's changing, qualitative and quantitative. We'll get into all of these fun things in a little bit when we talk a little bit more about data specifically. As you're coming in, please do check the chat for the link to menti.com along with the code. You'll see it right there at the top of the slide. Also, we're going to give about another minute and some change for you to share what comes to your mind when you hear the word data. Necessary. Yeah, we do need that. It is absolutely very necessary. It helps us kind of put the pieces together, right? Alrighty, friends, we're going to give that one more minute at most. Do go to menti.com and use the code 94003790 to share what comes to your mind when you hear the word data. Overwhelming analysis, exploration. All right. Fascinating. Oh, we have some curious thinkers today. That is wonderful. It does take a bit of curiosity and leaning into learning to be willing to look at data and see what it can tell us, right? Thank you, Angela. Fact finding. Yes, data is this is what it is. And those are the facts. So, what I'm seeing here is some very positive, happy words, as well as some little bit challenging ones around how people respond to data. And we're going to be thinking this session about how we can use data to tell stories and give a fuller picture of the experience of families. And we're going to talk about the value of those stories in connection to the data. And we're going to talk about and explore with you all today how data is used to share power and better understand inequities as they represent themselves so very, very well, unfortunately, in the child welfare system. Alrighty, so I think we're going to close this word cloud and celebrate what we've done together and sharing the ideas about what comes to mind when we think about data. I've been doing all this talking, and I must introduce myself. My name is Takoria Jones. I am a family consultant with the Capacity Building Center for States. I'm so glad to be here with you today. Being involved in the getting this session together, right? Being involved in that has provided to me a unique look at how we approach data plus narratives. It took the willingness from each team member to wade through can you explain that again? And let me see if I got this right. It took some time, and it should. It's a learning process. What it means to build data from information is no simple task. You have to be brave. You have to be willing to pair data work with folks whose life experience illustrate what are often stark, hard, and deep-seated inequities. So, welcome to Exploring the Use of Data to Tell Stories of Inequities, as this is the title of this Sweebie Session 2B. Today, we're going to take a little bit of a growth mindset look together. So, we're going to sit here together and think about things in a growth mindset way. When metrics meet narratives, and how the relationship between the two can illuminate opportunity to guide and celebrate transformation. So here's how we're going to make this session work for you all today. We are going to talk a little bit about data, and we are going to have some opportunities in the chat, and perhaps some of you will be able to come off mute and share where you are, what you're thinking about, and what are your experiences when looking at data and storytelling. And I know sometimes in my community, telling stories was not necessarily a good phraseology, right? It meant that you were lying about something. But as we're doing so many things in this 21st century, we are transforming that, right? And it's not about what can you come up with. It's more about seeing what's really there, seeing all the layers of what's really there. So we're not coming up with things when we're talking about storytelling. We're looking very closely at what is really there, and we're sharing that. But we're sharing what we find in those closer looks through people's lived experience, perspectives, through their lenses. So it's not the most easy thing to do, but we can do it, and we can figure it out together. Get some tips and clues, and some moral support, perhaps, for those of us who are feeling a little scared and overwhelmed about it. And I do have a couple of friends here with me today who are going to help in this session. And so, Haley, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, all. My name is Haley Aiken. I am a young adult consultant with the Capacity Building Center for States. And I'm here today to bring two lenses to this work. My professional lens as a social worker with 5 years of experience working in the child welfare field, and also my lived experience as someone who experienced the foster care system firsthand. I've been part of the planning team for this session and really second what Decoria has mentioned about appreciating the willingness of each team member to bring humility and vulnerability to these conversations. Having conversations around data, and particularly the inequities that we see within child welfare data, isn't always easy or comfortable, and it takes courage to do this work and come to it with an open-minded manner. I love all the words that we saw in that word chat. There's a lot of excitement around data and a lot of uncomfortability with data. So I really thank you for choosing this session and being here today to explore how we can tell those stories of inequities through data and learn how to do better. In today's session, there'll be much conversation around how to involve those with lived experience in data work. And I believe that that is really key to using data as a catalyst for change within the child welfare system. Lived experience experts are so needed in that conversation to fill the gaps that some of us may not be able to see yet. So as we move through the session today, I really encourage you to think through the ways that your agency engages people with lived experience and the ways that that work can be expanded and strengthened. So I'll pass it off to Kate to introduce herself as well.
Great, thanks Haley, and thanks to Coria. My name is Kate McElroy-Helm. I am on the data team for the Capacity Building Center for States, and I've also had the privilege to be on the planning team for this session, as well as the previous plenary session. And so today I'm going to share some data, and so that we can have some of those conversations. You know, my role on the data team is often helping to understand data, but then most importantly, really getting the right next questions out of the data and see where it can take us. And getting the right input is so important to that. And thinking creatively and as Decoria and Haley both said, being courageous to ask those tough questions and see if we can get to a point where the data really does feel like it's telling the story and gets us to a point where we can do something with that data, which, you know, we have a lot of information at our fingertips, but what do we do with that is often the toughest part of understanding the data. So thanks for being here today, and we're hoping to have a really nice, robust conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Haley and Kate, for introducing yourselves and moving this session right along. So next, we will have a polling question. And this is just to kind of let everybody uh, get an idea of who's here today in this Zoom room on this session. And so please do. What is your role in the child welfare space? So select all that apply and and we'll give this a few moments and we will share those results. And do remember that you can multi-select. So if you work for a government agency and you also have lived experience, please do indicate that it is okay in this space to share it all. And we're going to give this just another couple of moments, hoping everyone has had an opportunity to select at least one, but as many as you can, so we can see who all is here today. And just for a fairness, I will let you all know that I have lived experience as there's a couple I can select from. Lived experience, absolutely. I do perform a little bit of research related to child welfare, and I kind of work for a government child welfare agency, I suppose, being a family consultant here at the center. Alrighty, well, if we can wrap that up and take a look so we can all see who is in the room, how much experience we have in the room. Absolutely. That lived experience is such a valuable nugget no matter where you take it. You don't ever separate yourself from the life that you have when you go to work. It's right there with you. And it's a great way to kind of tap into other opportunities and ideas when it comes to this kind of work, especially. I may not be able to see the poll. I'm not quite sure. Okay. Alrighty. 58% work for a government child welfare agency. Excellent. And that is fabulous. And guess what? We have another friend that has joined us for this conversation, and I'm going to introduce him right now. His name is Devin Gilchrist, and he is the African American Child Welfare. I'm sorry, the African American Child Well-being. So we're moving that welfare word out of the way. Devin Gilchrist is the African American Child Well-being Unit Supervisor in the Minnesota Department of Human Services Child Safety and Permanency Division. Okay, so I did ask Devin to share with us a fun fact. So, Devin, if you want to come on in and tell us your fun facts, we'd love to hear it.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My apologies for being late. I was having, of course, all kinds of connection issues this morning and nothing was working right, but I figured it out without throwing my computer out the window. So I'm here. Wouldn't be a Thursday if it didn't happen. So yeah, again, I'm Devin Gilchrist. I work in DHS in Minnesota here. And my fun fact is that I am I would say, semi-avid cyclist, bicyclist, and I've done several long distance rides over the last few years. Probably the most grueling ride was a 110 or 114-mile ride through some mountainous parts of Colorado, which was a challenge. So that's my fun fact for the day.
Devin, thanks for sharing. That
Yep.
is amazing. That's a really focused practice there, that long distance bike riding. So we're going to just roll into some quick dialogue. And if you could just share, Devin, how did you come to be in your current position?
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be succinct in my response. And so, I've been working in child welfare. I know we're kind of getting away from that word, but child welfare, social services regarding children and families for the better part of probably 20 years. Started out in the nonprofit world, working with kids who were at that time in what was called long-term foster care, and who were also at that time called state wards too. And kind of morphed into a couple different situations and places in my career. I've always been very interested in data, obviously, as I've gone along the journey. And so I've gone from nonprofit, then got into the county system here in Minnesota, in Henry County, which is our most populous county, and worked as a child protection worker and a children's mental health worker for several years, doing that work. And then was able to kind of transition into state work. And when I came to the state about 7 or 8 years ago, I came into the state working in what was then called our quality assurance unit. And what they basically did was they coordinated our in-state CFSRs, children and family services reviews, and also coordinated our federal reviews too that we had every so often. And so going around our counties, we have 87 counties in Minnesota. And so going around the counties and reviewing their systems, looking at data, looking at what it says, but also digging into what is the story behind the data. Data is one thing, but what does it say behind the data? To really figure out kind of what drives each respective county, and how to help them improve on areas where maybe they're not as strong in their work as well. And also what's working too in other areas. And so from there, I transitioned into being our state foster care policy specialist and really looking at the data for out-of-home placement, looking at disparities and inequities, how they show up, regionally, how they show up across counties, as well, how they show up across program areas, would be child protection or voluntary placements or whatnot. So really looking at that data deeper. And then I was fortunate as we were trying to move in Minnesota towards a place of really being able to solve some of the ongoing disproportionality, overrepresentation, and disparity within our system. We developed an African American child wellbeing unit to really hone in on kind of the needs of this population. And you don't say African American, we're also talking about African heritage too, right? So it's not just African American, but other populations too that may have heritage rooted in African nations. And so, looking at the data in terms of overrepresentation, how we show up, is really crucial. And what I'm trying to do on my end, and I'm not necessarily a data person per se, but what I'm trying to do is really try to figure out how can we use the data differently than we've been using it before. Let's not make it status quo. Let's not do the same thing over and over again, but really trying to use data in a more intelligent way, in a more targeted, intentional way to really get to the stories. And then doing so in a partnered way where we able to engage our partners, our stakeholders, I mean community people with lived experience, workers, county agencies, you name it, court system, to really embed that work into how we create solutions. And I see a question about other minority groups, and I will say this, that in my particular role, I do focus on one kind of population, but I've always approached from this standpoint of that we can use this universally too. The way we use data is not specific to just this population. So I really encourage that at a very broad, universal level going forward, and really trying to figure out how do we then um, apply this across the board because it's all child welfare, and what's good for one population can also work for other populations. And so I'm using my role to kind of push that across the board universally, while also create some intentionality within that process to look at certain populations that are overrepresented or have historically been marginalized within the system.
And Devin, when you talk about that, we get a good sense that you've been in this work for a while. You've got understanding and appreciation of data, why it's collected, how it's collected, what it can tell you
Mhm.
in and of itself. And if you could quickly perhaps tell us a little bit about the most important things to consider when looking at data and looking also to tell those stories of inequities, to narrate those difficult things that you've been seeing.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things now, and not in any particular order, but I think I'm always trying to encourage us as a practice to dig deeper, right? To truly dig into this as much as we can, to ask the questions we're not asking, to not be satisfied with just what we're presenting, but really dig into the data and see what it yields and find out what are we missing. And I see a question about kind of how and whom is it and analyzed. That's exactly right. I think we've done it too much kind of internally and siloed. Let's broaden that and share the data with people and have conversations and break it down because one perspective is not enough. We have to have multiple people looking at data differently and sharing stories and sharing ideas and coming to conclusions of what it may mean. Data tells a story, like I said, but it doesn't tell the entire story all the time. And it depends how you look at it. So I think we try to really understand that it's just multi-lens to looking at data. And if we look at it from one kind of lane or one perspective, we may miss other perspectives or other ideas or other things that it will tell us. And that can really be crucial to us developing solutions and guiding the work. And so I think just trying to be open to that process and being very transparent and being very engaging with our partners. And I say partners very broadly, but that should include everybody. It shouldn't just include one group or one person or one agency or one organization. It's really about including everybody in conversations about data.
Devin, that's a great point and a great pivot to our next poll about confidence in using the data. So everyone within the child well-being partnerships should have an idea of what's going on out there, right? But so we're asking all of you present with us today, how confident are you in using the data available to you to tell stories? So of the data that you know, the data that you've seen, the data that you are, you know, interacting with. How confident are you in using that to tell stories? Yes, then we love the emoji scale very much. And we'll just give you a few moments so we can continue this conversation. And this is the one answer. And as you listen a bit about what Devin has shared, we're going to do a little uh, transition to talking more about data. We're going to talk a little bit about a particular measure of data, and we're going to hand that over to Kate. And I'm seeing from Rachel in the chat that 43% of you illustrious participants today um, are kind of smack dab in the middle. And that's pretty cool to me, 21% of us chose 4, so we're pretty good, pretty confident in using it. Aha, and there's a bit of a notch point there, right? The quality of data. So that's keep that in your tucked behind your ear. We'll get that to that in just a minute. I'm going to hand it over to Kate to talk about the placement stability measure and data.
Great, thanks so much to Corey, and thanks everyone for your great participation so far. So we wanted to show some real data today and get some conversation going, as Corey mentioned. And so we're going to use one of the measures that's used in the Child and Family Services Review, and talk about what it would really take to fully understand the story behind the numbers that we're looking at, and some of the questions that it would raise. So the Child and Family Services Review is how public child welfare agencies are monitored. There are several outcomes that are considered, and the placement stability measure tells us what rate children in out-of-home care are changing placements. So how stable is their living condition? And so this is one of the 5 statewide data indicators that look at outcomes related to permanency. And these are done using national data sets. You might be familiar with AFCARS and NCANS. Those are the 2 of the national data sets where agencies submit their data directly to the federal government. And then these indicators are calculated using those data sets. And so states receive information on how they're performing on these indicators every 6 months. And hopefully using that data in lots of different ways, and to have lots of different conversations about how things are going, and what they can be, what we can be doing differently to serve children and families. So we recognize that many of you are very knowledgeable about these, maybe more than you'd even like to be, and some might be a little bit new too. So we're going to go through probably a little quickly just to make sure we can get to the conversation. But if you have any questions as we go, there's lots of knowledgeable people in the chat who can help you. And we'll also provide some resources at the end if you're curious. Okay, so this is the basic formula that's used for this indicator. So first, to go to the bottom up to the denominator, we're looking at a 12-month period, so 1 year, and the children who entered care during that year. And then we add up all the days that each of those children were in care. So on the next slide, we're going to see an example with real numbers, just to help, because that's how my brain always understands these a little bit better. So stay tuned for that. But first, in the numerator on top, we'll see the number of placement changes that happened during that year for those children. So the first placement doesn't count; that's their initial placement. But every time they've moved after that, we count up the number of moves that those children in the population have had. So as our example, you can say, so to keep things a little bit simple, our state, let's say our state has, our jurisdiction has 5 children that entered care during that year. The top box there shows the number of days that they were in care during that year. So child 5 entered on the first day and stayed the whole time, and then others stayed for shorter periods of time. So if we add up all those days, we come up with that number 1,028. So that's going to be the denominator. And then we look at the number of times each of those children moved placements. So child 1 and child 3 stayed in their initial placement, and then the others had a few moves that added up to 6. And then we do the division and come up with a small decimal. And so we multiply that by 1,000 to make it a more meaningful number. So then the rate that we come up with is 5.8 moves per 1,000 days in care. So this this is real data from this is nationwide data. And this is the same measure that we just talked about, but broken down by the race and ethnicity categories that are available to us through AFCARS. That top purple bar is for all children, so that we can see against that how different of these race and ethnicity categories might compare to the rate. So since we're measuring placement changes, we're wanting the number to be lower. So a lower rate is going to be better performance. That means we've had more kids stay in stable placements. And so the higher the number, that means the higher the rate of placement changes. And so you'll see, as I mentioned, these are the categories that are available through AFCARS. We also at the bottom have some unknown and missing information. So that gets back to the data quality point that was made earlier. You have to think about that. And so this is what I'm going to turn things back over to Coria and Devin and others to talk through this a little bit more.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Kate. And look, that took us a while because people were like, can you explain that again in our team meeting? So thank you so much for that. And I'd like to ask you participants today, so just as a basic question, if all children ages 0 to 17, if that rate is 4.0, if you could just look at those bars and maybe tell me who was over that average. It's a really simple, just to kind of get into it and get a little confidence around what you see there. So just drop that in the chat. What categories there went over that national rate that we are looking to decrease overall? And we're going to get back to Devin. Look at that, getting some good answers in the chat. I'm going to get back to Devin. I'm Devin, and I want to share with you that when I think about data and I think about lived experience, those two things have a lot of similarities, right? Data is collected, you get a bunch of little numbers and you put them all together. Each individual number means something, but it doesn't mean as much as they do when they all come together. And build towards the overall data. It takes some effort to do all of that. There's some mistakes. Sometimes things need to be redone, reevaluated, adjusted, right? And then this is pretty much the same with narratives or stories or anecdotes. They've been called all kind of things. Everybody has a story, and stories can come from experiences of life, which of course vary widely. And I'm sure there's a technical term for varying widely, but I'm not that person today. I'm the happy facilitator. But I'm sure there's the technical name for it. Stories can fit into general topic areas, right? So if you're looking at this and you want to know about the Asian experience within that, well, then you would know that there's a 3.6%, 3.6 rate there. And you would say, well, that's under the national rate. And how would that look? How can we learn? What can we learn to do to fill in the gaps, or how can we celebrate that? And what does that look like for our Asian community to have a rate that's lower? There's something we can take from that. So there's that general topic area, but what cannot be missed is that when combining these things, stories give an opportunity to connect data points. Stories are the filament between what nameless, faceless numbers can tell us, because stories give names and faces to data. Devin, we're going to talk a little bit more about this here. You are in the placement division there in Hennepin County. What would you like to share with us about looking at these placement rates and understanding how that looks in real time?
Yeah, a couple things I think about, and I saw an earlier comment in the chat about unpacking the data, and that's exactly what I'm thinking about. Is what does this mean? First off, what am I trying to do with the data? Am I just using data to show trends in current circumstances, or am I really trying to use it to guide my work towards addressing what I see in the data? I think there's things that we know anecdotally that exist in terms of um, historical, racism, structural racism, bias, prejudice, all those things, marginalization, oppression that exists. But I think also I look at kind of what does this mean real time? So we have African American, for example, and you can apply this to any particular category. But how does that break down? Okay, how does it break down across gender? How does it break down across ages? How does it break down across regions? Rural versus in-state. Certain metro areas. I wonder about how do we break that down and engage people who have further lived experience in the process to find out what they're seeing. So how do I engage, kids who are in foster care, parents who have children in foster care, providers? I wonder about the stability across types of placements, looking at voluntary versus involuntary, looking at relative versus not relative, non-relative, right? I just wonder all those things to really get a deeper level as what does this really mean when we see this 4.6 or 3.6 or 4.2? What does that really tell us? And what's really driving that? And then for people who aren't experiencing instability, for the kids who maybe are able to stay in one placement, the entire time, what's working there too? What about that placement? What about that process? What about that case is working? So I think it's not just looking at what's wrong, but also what's working right and finding that happy medium between the two. But I think you have to engage different levels of people to unpack and have conversations and see where the commonalities are. You may see some very similar things. You may say that, parents and workers and judges all say that when there's a very highly involved social worker, that stability is, maintained or supported, right? Um, and conversely, when there's not one, you see the opposite. So really, what does that really mean when you unpack this data? And again, what am I trying to use the data for? What's the accomplishment or the goal I'm trying to use the data to meet? But I think we have the ability, to do that across lots of data sets, not just ability, lots of data sets, and show what's really happening and dig deeper into it and really give context, and look at it qualitatively and quantitatively as well, and really get that anecdotal context to what's happening to really figure out, okay, real time on the ground, how do we now use this in a very productive way to do, improve our practice or create solutions or create resources or services to um, level the field and address those disparities we see in the data itself.
And one of the ways we do that, Devin, right, is to think about the right questions. And that's often a challenge in figuring out the right questions to get the appropriate information. So we can really tell the story of what's happening and address some of those issues about, well, I know that there's a need there, but I don't quite know how to meet it.
Mhm.
And when we're thinking about that, how is it? Could you talk a little bit about those with lived experience and how their role in getting to the right questions and developing solutions may be?
And again, I'm just giving my sense, my 2 cents here. I think that they have to be a partner. They have to be a real partner, not just people that you go in and engage every once in a while, but real partners, and creating spaces for them to come in and be valued members of the process, right? And having conversations with them that are authentic and genuine, and not coming off as government agencies as we know best and being very paternalistic, right? Coming in as help us understand this, help us share this, help us figure out what's going on. You're the experts. We're not the experts. So help us figure this out. And then I think, like an earlier chat message, that also sharing information on our end, because there's things that we see on our end that maybe they don't know either. And being able to have a collaborative dialogue, right? Where it's not necessarily contentious, but it's a dialogue. It's meant to figure out working towards a place of solution, right? And I think that when we've done that intentionally and purposefully, to really do that with a common goal at hand, I think we've had some good success doing that. I think when we've done it the opposite way, and just brought folks in for, you know, um, different things when we haven't done enough to be more intentional about how we do that, right? I think we haven't seen the results we're looking for. So I think you have to have that intentionality. And I think sometimes it's asking those questions, and sometimes saying, what aren't we asking? Hey, public, hey, moms, dad, what are we missing? What should we be asking that we're not doing right now? So I think it's having that space that's open, and being able to create a process or a stream of working that really gets us to a place of really understanding this data deeper, at different perspectives, right? And then we can really dig and say, okay, this is what we're hearing from moms, this is what we're hearing from dads. Here's the overlap, here's the differences, and really being able to really craft a response, whether that be policy or practice or a resource or a grant designed to address a need or all the above, to really be effective and sustainable, not just being something that we put out there that doesn't work and then we're back to the drawing board in a year, 2 years, 5 years. So really being able to move that process forward in a really collaborative and really intentional way.
Collaboration and intent, those words are so important, and especially, and they're equally important, right? With data, you have to be intentional and cooperative in finding those data points and putting them all together. And then you also have to maintain that same movement when you're bringing these stories in to illustrate and express what the data says. We had a good amount of response in the chat about your comments there, and I want to thank you very much. And I also want to give participants an opportunity to talk about lived experience. So it's not always very comfortable from my experience in sharing my lived experience. But it is a thing that has to happen, right? It has to be supported, and it has to be valued by the agencies that are collecting that data. As valuable as the data team is, that lived experience narrative has equal opportunity to be valuable. So if there's anyone in the chat, if you'd like to share a little bit about your experiences in lived experience, sharing your story in professional settings, there's an opportunity for agencies represented here today to learn a little bit more about how that feels. And when you are being brought to the table, Devin, like you so wisely mentioned, that it's a must. It is a necessity. It is something that has to happen because it is valuable, and it does create a bit of a buy-in, right? The community learns about the data gets to share about the community. So if there's anyone who'd be willing to talk a little bit about what that looks like and give agency members here, professional agency representatives, an insight into that. And if not, it's absolutely fine. We do have a few more minutes here. Devin, I would ask you a final question, um, and maybe help others think about it as well. And if you could react to maybe an instance where you learned some data and you were able to shift a bit in the work that you were doing.
That's a great question. What comes to mind, and it maybe isn't the best answer to your question, but what comes to mind is when I was doing the CFSR work in our state, and I also had the ability to do some federal CFSR work in a couple other states too, in their federal reviews. And there was a question on there about the fathers. I can't remember exactly what the question was, but it was basically about the agency efforts to engage the father. And it basically was like, yes or no, did you do it or not do it? And I just thought, wow, what does that mean? Like, okay, so they say yes, and you don't get information. And they say no, you don't get information. You don't know why they didn't do it, or why they did do it. You don't know anything. And it felt like it really gave agencies an easy way to kind of just, you know, um, not work with fathers, and I'm always big on working with both parents. And I know that fathers oftentimes get the short end of the stick in many ways in some capacities within child welfare. So, I just don't like the data, would show it might be a strength, but really, is it really, or another question on the CFSR was about relative placement. And basically, as long as the kid was with a relative for at least one day during that period in review, it was a strength. Well, is that really a strength? If the kid moved the next day and has a high degree of instability. So I try to look at like, what does that really mean? And what are we missing by not asking the right questions again? And I think that I've just, you know, knowing data, you can use data to tell all kinds of stories. Is the right story? Not necessarily sometimes. But I think we have to just really keep digging and just ask the questions. And I am very apt to go ask my research team, hey, can you pull this for me? Because I'm just curious to know what it means, what it says. Can you look at this for me? I think, and then if our systems don't capture data the way we need them, then how do we make efforts to change our systems, right? If we're not capturing the data we think is important, then let's not stop and say, well, that's just what we capture. How do we redesign our systems to really give us data we're looking for in a way that's meaningful as well? So I think we have the capacity in many ways. We just have to, again, back to that intentionality. We have to be intentional about what we do and just change our practice and change our way of doing things, and really pushing ourselves as states, as counties, as community organizations, and really being able to change the way we do business. If that makes sense.
That makes all the sense. And that absolutely brings us to the end of our session today. Thank you so much, Devin, for your time. Thank you, each and every one of you who joined us here at the session 2B today. Please continue to enjoy the Child Welfare Virtual Expo as much as you can. There is a closing slide that will let you know that we'll try to hang out a bit in the virtual gallery if you have any questions or concerns. Everything is recorded. If you have some question you'd like to ask, get it in the chat. And we thank you so much for your time today. I hope you've gotten something that you can use, at least think about, and build a little bit of confidence and be encouraged.